Before we look at the rest of the slides and start to get into question itself, there's an image that I find really interesting. I think it's on a papyrus sheet or it's painted on a wall, I believe. And this depicts music in ancient Egypt. And the interesting thing with this question, um, perhaps more like from a philosophical sense and also from a social and cultural history lens, is that we can never really, for ancient history at least, we can never know what music sounded like. We can only see, for example, depictions of sheet music. We can only see, for example, images such as this one. And it kind of brings into mind the complexity of answering and researching a question like this. How do we, understand what music was like in the first place if we don't have certain sources for it? And secondly, also brings into question how can we establish causality between music and a significant historical event or a significant progression of events in history, which is what the question is asking you to do. So I would recommend for your homework, you could pause the video now and quickly make down a few notes. Perhaps put down a list of your 5 favorite singers or musicians or bands and give examples of ways in which they have changed history or examples of ways in which you think they might be able to change history. So feel free to pause the video at this moment and discuss. And I think we already see in the modern period in this century how music can be hugely significant. So, for example, some of you may remember Beyonce's police brutality song called Formation, which was released, I think, in 2016 or 2015, and it caused a huge uproar in the US. But then it's difficult to say, did this actually significantly change or impact the nature of like the police brutality in the US? Similarly with Taylor Swift, she has huge political power. We saw that even just last month with her Eras tour. To what extent can we establish a linkage between these musicians and, by extent, their music and, a significant political change or significant social, economic, cultural change? And I think these are the first primary questions that I want you to start to think about before we delve into the rest of the answer. So let's look at slide 3. And I think this question is going to be interesting for many of you because the kind of history that you do at school is going to be primarily political, with perhaps a little bit of social and economic history. I think the vast majority of students entering this competition are not going to have a background in cultural history. So just for context, the areas I specialised in at Cambridge were social and cultural history, which I personally think are the most interesting parts of history and perhaps the most difficult to get access to as a student. But it makes it necessitates you thinking about history in ways that don't just include, for example, political figures or economic figures, but also more complex things like, for example, the history of emotions or the history of how ordinary people lived their lives. And of course, for this, much like the sources that we have for music,